Welcome to Community Voices for Housing Equality, Understanding Pathways to Eviction. We have two lecturers, Dr. Kara Byrne and Dr. Rich Medina. Dr. Byrne works here at the College of Social Work as a research professor and also teaches a couple classes. Dr. Medina is a professor from geography and extremism, and so we welcome him for visiting social work. And I'll turn the time over to them. And are you ready?
Yeah. I'm ready. All right, thanks everybody for coming. Since we have such a small group, I was hoping to maybe hear from all of you what drew you to it, maybe just like a sentence or two on what drew you to this topic on housing. Can I start with you?
Oh.
Obviously, I'm a teacher. I'm like immediately drawing from the students.
Yeah, sure. I think I just wanted to come to this because I know very little, and because I am my interest in homelessness and stuff, I really want to understand, how these people
Excellent. Great. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thanks. Gabrielle?
I'm Gabrielle. I do outreach work for mentally ill homeless. So probably could learn something from this that may help me with what I do.
Sure. Cool. Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
But it will be helpful because I am looking at some people who are killed and more.
Sure. Great. Thank you for coming. So CEUs are what they need for licensure, right? So continuing education. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about two pieces, but primarily, Community Voices for Housing Equality is the foundation for all of this work. So like Delva said, I'm Kara, and this is Dr. Richard Medina. And there's two phases to the Community Voices for Housing Equality. I'm just going to call that CVHE from now on. There's two phases to our research. So there's phase one, which consisted of community dialogues and developing CVHE, which is actually a big part of our research because CVHE is a participatory action research project. So phase one was facilitating those community dialogues, and also is where Rich and I met, was when I was presenting on phase one. Phase two is where Dr. Medina and I came together, and now this is more focused on specifically analyzing evictions. We are using a mixed methods approach, doing a spatial analysis of evictions and some in-depth interviews, and I've also hired some community RAs, which is a critical component to doing community-based research. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a foundation, do a brief introduction to phase one, and then we'll talk more in depth on phase two, the analyzing evictions. So we're going to present for about 40 minutes and then open it up for Q&A. So why did we choose to focus on housing and renters with low incomes? Primarily in the field of social work, this is super important because what we know is that stable and affordable housing is important for the neighborhoods where the people that we're working with live. Stable and affordable housing lends itself to community stability. It's like a foundation for community stability. And we also know that it has that it's related to child and family outcomes, specifically with regards to health outcomes for children and also educational outcomes. And we also know that the experiences of low-income renters in particular tend to be characterized by housing instability and unplanned mobility. Unplanned mobility is moving from place to place out of no choice of your own. So it's different than like getting a job and moving, right? Or having a job move you from place to place. It's getting kicked out of your place. So like I said, Community Voices for Housing Equality is a participatory action research project. And if you're not familiar with that, so I'm not going to get too into it today, but it's just important for you to know that PAR, participatory action research, is different than traditional research in that it engages stakeholders as co-researchers. And it's based on this premise that people hold knowledge about their lives that's valuable. Participatory action research is action-oriented, and so I'll show you a little bit about of the action that we took as a result of the research that we did. And also PAR is aimed at amplifying stories and experiences from people who are typically underrepresented in policy and in the communities. So it centers those voices. So it took about 2 years to develop CVHE. It started with my time as a social worker at the Heartland Partnership Center on the west side of Salt Lake City, where I developed trust with people in the community, particularly renters that have low incomes and have refugee or immigrant background. And in that time, I started to hear stories about people who were feeling what they felt was discrimination or unfair practices from landlords. Something was going on. So I brought people together. We met around the table, and working with the community identified that, yes, community-based participatory research was something that community members were ready to be a part of, and focusing on housing and tenant-landlord relationships was our starting point. And so over the course of 2 years, we formed the glue that created CVHE, and we developed our logo and mission statement. So here's our logo, which we developed together with Hilberto Abdul-Khalik, myself, and Ellie Goldberg. These are the founding members of CVHE. We actually started a little bit bigger than that. We had 2 or 3 other people who, over the course of the last 2 years, actually had to drop off because of obligations in life. Things happen. But we still stay in touch with them. They still inform our process, but they're not a core part of the team anymore. And now CVHE is composed of 2 more faculty members, Evis Garcia and Rich, obviously, and then these are our 2 community research assistants. And a number of the people in these pictures are co-researchers who actually are not affiliated with the University of Utah, except as they're community members living typically on the west side of Salt Lake City who are renting, and their affiliation with the university is just through this research project. Our mission statement that we developed is collaboratively developed is that we are a group of community stakeholders who want to learn from, educate, and advocate for people experiencing inequality and unfairness in housing. We want to initiate change so people can experience fair housing. So just going back to here, you can see that PAR is a little bit different than traditional research. We developed a research team, we have a mission statement and a logo, and our mission statement is aimed towards social justice. It's just a little more social justice oriented. So phase 1 of our research focused on tenants that have refugee and immigrant background, and that's what I'm going to briefly describe. And then Rich is going to, and then we'll go into phase 2 where Rich will talk about our spatial analysis, and I'll introduce the interviews that we're going to be doing. So phase 1 research questions, particularly working with tenants with refugee and immigrant background, focused on these 4 research questions, which were developed collaboratively with community members. How do renters with low incomes describe their experiences renting? What issues with landlords do renters with low incomes face when renting? How do renters with low incomes experience landlord responsiveness? And what barriers exist for renters to access their rights? So these questions were critical for people that were or probably currently are living in the community where I was working and where we developed the research project. So it was really centering this these urgent issues in research. Doing research because it was important to community members at the time. So what we did was we facilitated 8 one-hour community dialogues. Community dialogues are similar to focus groups, except because we had community members as co-researchers, oftentimes they would speak back to some of the things that they were hearing in the focus groups and validate what people were saying or add things to them. So they actually were participating at points. So we're actually referring to them as community dialogues as opposed to traditional focus groups. In total, we talked to 48 people. Everybody that we talked to was renting with, or had a low income, and they were renting, and they had a refugee or immigrant background. And we facilitated the focus groups in English, Spanish, and Somali. We had 2 facilitators for each of the focus groups, and all along our research was characterized by the co-researchers dialoguing together. So not just facilitating the focus groups, but actually the conversations that were happening in between the focus groups and the analysis along the way were part of our research process as a whole. Part of our methods were also reflecting on what was going on in the process and how it affected us as community members or university faculty, and then celebrating our successes along the way. And that was part of creating the glue in the research team. And then we engaged in what's called participatory analysis. As a team, we analyzed the research findings. I can talk more about those things at a later time, but because we're going to be talking about the analyzing evictions, I'm kind of summing up what happened. So, but these were our findings. So we centered the voices, the voices of low-income tenants with refugee and immigrant background. And what we found when we asked people about their experiences is that a lot of tenants with low incomes who have refugee and immigrant background tend to face the following issues when dealing with landlords or when renting in general. So they face language barriers. There was difficulty with navigating the fine print in their leases. They found that there were policies in place that inhibited their ability to communicate. It was a one-way communication flow between the tenant and the landlord. There was a lack of housing choices, which led people to feel powerless and hopeless. There was a lot of stereotyping that was happening, and which people tended to feel like legitimized landlords' actions that were unfair. And then they also found that they would come up against barriers to understanding, but more importantly, accessing their rights. And I say more importantly because a lot of our interventions that are targeting tenants, trying to help them know their rights or access their rights, are focused on giving them knowledge about what their rights are. And it's not so much, I mean, that's part of it. Understanding rights is one thing. But what's more important in a gap in policy right now is the ability to access those rights. If you're a tenant with a low income and you can't afford a lawyer, making it to a Tuesday night pro bono clinic is really difficult for a lot of people. So there need to be more options there. But all in all, leading to what many felt was a lack of landlord accountability, feelings of hopelessness and powerlessness, and a lack of transparency when it comes to the tenant-landlord relationship. But what we wanted to really highlight all through this is that tenants are doing a lot to negotiate power, even in situations like this where they feel hopeless or powerless. And some things that they do to negotiate power might seem like everyday common, an everyday common obligation that a tenant has, which is true. But the point here is that tenants are going above and beyond. And so they're maintaining very clean homes. They're using traditional remedies for pest control. So when their landlord is unresponsive, they're taking matters into their own hands. And when I say maintaining very clean homes, I mean scrubbing out underneath refrigerators. And this was really important for tenants to know, for tenants to share with us in the dialogues that they take pride in their home. Helping and relying on help from the community. Going to family and friends for translating documents, utilizing mutual assistance offices, and also creating a community liaison model within an apartment complex where one tenant would serve as a liaison with the landlord, between the landlord and the families, and that was really effective, but largely dependent on a cooperative landlord. So some of the recommendations that we walked away from were there needs to be improved communication between tenants and landlords, utilizing mediation and translation services. There needs to be increased public funding to maintain and build affordable housing across the county. That's obvious. I think a lot of people would agree with that. There needs to be increased funding for formalized resources for tenants with refugee and immigrant backgrounds specifically. We also would recommend utilizing the community liaison model like I just talked about, and increasing access to legal services, affordable legal services, more pro bono clinics in locations that are accessible, and at times that are convenient for tenants that are working 3 jobs, or tend to have low incomes and tend to work more than one job, have larger families. So some of the action that we took, which is part of our research process, was facilitating a Fair Housing Expo, where we brought together a lot of fair housing advocates and the head of, and we also put on a pro bono clinic on a Saturday. And this is the head of Utah Legal Services, Martin Blomstein, speaking in front of a crowd of tenants. Okay, it's hard for me to summarize what that whole phase was, but that led us to phase 2, which is analyzing evictions. And that's where we are today, and that's where Rich and I come together on this research. So why did we choose to focus on evictions for the second phase? Well, to begin with, it was clear from our findings from the first round of research that tenants aren't really operating on an even playing field when it comes to tenants and landlords. And also the research team, CVHE, decided that focusing on evictions is really important, and that was the next step and probably the biggest driving force for choosing our next topic of study. And after talking to other people in the community, we started to hear this, something to the tune of, we know that someone's profiting from these evictions. There has to be something going on. Is there anything that we can show? There's somebody that's, that seems to be profiting more, where the landlords are losing a lot of cases, where the tenants are losing a lot of cases and a lot of money as a result, and a lot of credit on opportunities to access affordable housing or access the apartments in their neighborhood. So what we know is that in 2015, which is the sample of evictions that we took from and I'll talk more about where we got those, there were 4,019 evictions filed. What we know is that legal representation, when evictions are filed, when a property management company files an eviction and uses a legal team, that legal representation makes around $700 at a minimum per eviction. On average, there were around 11 filings a day, which means that a legal representative could make around $7,700 a day. And this legal representation, these lawyers who are representing landlords are making around $2.8 million a year in evictions. So that's a lot of money. So what we know is that this is an urgent issue, that there's something going on, and we want to look a little bit deeper into it to find out who's getting evicted, who's losing the money, and how can we level the playing field a little bit more? Because it seems a little bit skewed at the moment. So in addition to moving into the next phase of research, we acquired funding from the University of Utah Vice President of Research's office to do this research, and we used a good portion of that money to hire 2 people from the community as research assistants. So they take on a lot of, these research assistants have experience being evicted or intimately know people who have been evicted in Salt Lake County. They speak Spanish and English, and they currently live in the community that we're focusing on, and they currently rent. And their job description as a community research assistant is like any other traditional research assistant that you might find for a student at the University of Utah. But in addition, it includes that we have expectations that they will share their firsthand knowledge with us from the community and their renting experience, and that they also will they do play a strong role in helping us design this next phase of research. And that includes helping inform the data points that we put on the map when it comes to what socioeconomic factors do we want to overlay with eviction points, which will make more sense in a second. They are helping us design the interview script, and they're also helping us design the survey. So they're actually playing a very critical role in designing the research and implementing the research as well. So stage 1 of phase 2, there's lots, I break things down maybe too much, but so we're on phase 2, but the first phase of this was to gather all those evictions. So we gathered the 2015 addresses for everybody that had an eviction filed against them from the Matheson Courthouse Law Library. So myself and a couple university research assistants went into the courthouse, sat at the law library, and pulled out one by one the addresses of people who had evictions filed against them in 2015, which took a lot of time. It's not easy to get that information, but it is public. We gathered the 2015 demographic data as well using US Census data, and we determined which layers that we wanted to put on the map. And for this, we not only pulled on what we know from the literature as correlating with evictions, but we also relied on community leaders to help us identify we asked them, what do you think is contributing to evictions? Describe an eviction to us. Who's being evicted in your community? And that helped us inform what variables we would be looking at with regards to correlating with eviction in the community. So is it larger families? Is it people whose first language is not English? Is it people who tend to have lower incomes? What were they seeing? So we wanted to get information like that. We hired our community research assistants. I think you saw that. We hired Beam and Evelyn. And then we developed maps and the web interface, which gets us to, in my opinion, one of the coolest parts of our research, which is the GIS analysis, which is where the geographer comes in. How you put that on first?
Okay, thanks. All right, so my part of the research is the spatial analysis, the mapping, what we call geographic information systems, which is basically taking these things and putting them on a map, and this gives us the ability to run analysis and look at different spatial patterns and really anything that we can do on a map. Now, we aggregated those points. Every single one of those points is an eviction in Salt Lake County. We aggregated those to the block group level, and the census levels go from block to block group to census tract to city and then county and so on and so forth. The block group level is relatively small. We're looking at an area of a few blocks, a few city blocks, and that's based on population density within the county. So what we're seeing here is all those evictions as points, but the block groups in red are the ones that where we have 9 to 18% as a normalized figure of evictions, given the number of households within that block group. So we got our block groups on here. We mapped out which ones were best, which ones were the worst for evictions. We ran some descriptive statistics, which I'll talk about, and then our next steps, which I'll talk about a little bit later, are to build some type of spatial model or a predictive model. Let me see. Let me go back a second, and let me show the oh, it's too big. So this is our web interface that we put together. It's fully interactive. It hasn't been released to the public yet because we have to make some final changes, but at some point we see this being released to the public so anybody out there can see where those evictions are, how they stack up with different social factors, and do their own research. Now, if we zoom in here, we can see some of the block groups with different issues. Let's see here. Now, we can turn on and off different background maps. If we want to show the block groups that have the most poverty, we can do that and look at with respect to where those evictions are happening. Okay. We also have the median rent, percent of single parent households, percent Latino households, percent Asian, percent Black, Pacific Islander, Indian, Native American, other, and percent foreign born. And these are the socioeconomic factors or the demographic factors that we have pulled out thus far. There's going to be more in the future. So basically, I just wanted to show this tool that we're trying to put together to release to the public. Okay, so back to the slides here, and this is just a map that we made from that. If you look at those factors that I mentioned and whether or not they correlate, some do and some don't, the p-value tells you whether it's correlated. You want that smaller than 0.05, which most of these are, except for median year built, which means that doesn't play a factor in the rate of evictions per block group. 0.07 does not either. 0.07 is too big. We want the ones closer to 0. So if you look at the ones that have the most effect or the most effect on the rate of evictions, we're looking at the percent of households in poverty. We're looking at the percent single parent households, percent Black, percent Native American, percent Pacific Islander, percent Latino is one of the ones with the most effect, percent foreign born, and percent other. And percent other is interesting because these are the people that have said, we are not any of these races, we're something else. And oftentimes that can be Latinos that feel that they don't fit into the white race, they don't fit into Asian, they don't fit into Black. So they might mark other, and other people out there. And that's a really subjective issue when you're saying that we don't fit into the census's categories for race. But still, for those people that are marking other, it's a really high effect on that variable of evictions. The ones that are negative are the median rent, which I think you would expect. Lower rent is higher evictions, and the percent white. So the block groups that we see in Salt Lake County that are higher percent white, you have a lower rate of evictions, right? Which again, maybe we would expect. But to be able to show that quantitatively is something that's not done very often, for evictions at least. We looked at specific block groups to see how different they were from the average within the county. These are the county averages here. County average for the block groups is 1% eviction rate. These are looking at 10%, 11%, 10% eviction rate. You can also see that the poverty percentages are very high compared to an 11% poverty rate. Median year built didn't really matter. The rent also, if your average is 1081, your rent is really low, 756, 838, 824. So basically we're just looking at how those block groups that we see a lot of evictions occurring in, how do they stack up? A big one that stands out here again is the percent Latino in these two, and definitely here at 63% Latino for that block group. Single parent, again, 28%, 21%. And down here we just have 8%. So there's a big difference. There's a big difference in the block groups that we're looking at with people that are being evicted at very high rates versus an average block group for the county. Okay, we looked at some of these specific addresses, and this is something that I think we're going to investigate much further, that some of these addresses have a really high eviction count. So we're probably looking at big apartment complexes, something like that. We have a lot of people living there. But 52 evictions for a year, for 1 year, is a really high number. 44, and we just mapped out everything here that's over 10. Over 10 evictions for the year. And they're scattered relatively randomly throughout the valley, it looks like. Most of these are in areas where you have low eviction rates, in these blue areas, 0 to 3% eviction rates. But again, that's probably, one big apartment building where you have a lot of evictions. Okay, so the next steps for this, to check other variables. There are a few more variables we looked at, like language variables and stuff that I'm gonna pull, and we'll do some further correlations to see how they affect the eviction variable. Other analysis, a geographic weighted regression, maybe something that gives us the opportunity to maybe look at how those socioeconomic and demographic factors, how can we predict the rates of evictions based on those variables. And that is it. Oh. Sorry.
Okay, and the final step in the eviction analysis is to follow up with some in-depth interviews to understand pathways to evictions. And so we haven't done these yet, but we're planning on doing 20 one-hour interviews with tenants who have been evicted from the cities. If we can do the areas that were red on the map with the high rates of eviction, we're trying to find people who have been evicted from those areas. We are recruiting, which I know sounds difficult, but we believe we can do it because we are working with the community research assistants, and we also have a lot of organizations that know what we're doing and are invested. We're recruiting through those local organizations and snowballing, which means we're going to interview some tenants and then say who do they know, what friends do they have, and use the snowballing technique. And we're going to do some diverse sampling for our interviews. So we want to try to talk to single people and larger families. We want to talk to people of color and white people. We want to talk to the people that were evicted from the east side and also from those neighborhoods with higher densities of eviction. So the east side, we might do 2 or 3 families just to kind of get a feel for how different those experiences might be. We want to talk to we want to talk to people who live in large multifamily apartment complexes and small apartment complexes, along with single family homes. And then we want to talk to people who have received housing assistance and those who aren't getting any. We want to do these interviews to help us understand what are the pathways to eviction so we can develop some policy recommendations that might prevent evictions. And we also want to know what's the impact of eviction or forced displacement on these individuals or families. So in summary, the eviction or the Analyzing Evictions project is composed of the mixed method study, and in the end we want to really facilitate some research that's going to have an impact on the communities that we work with. So that is it. Are there any questions? I don't know, do we go right in, Delva, do we go right into the Q&A or? Yeah, okay, cool. So are there any questions about our methods or what we plan to do next? Yeah.
It's fascinating, but I'm just curious, so with that $2.8 million, so is this beneficial for attorneys that they can do evictions, or is it beneficial for the landlords? Like, why is this such a problem? Who's trying to, who's winning?
Yeah, this is for the attorney just for filing. So regardless of who wins the case. So it's probably even more, but yeah, so regardless of who wins the case.
And
if
the
it,
landlord pays that to the
Yes.
tenant have to-
Well, the tenant might be forced to pay down the line, but depending on who wins. But yeah, this would be an attorney that's making this from a landlord. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what do the landlords get out of it?
It's a good question. And actually, part of our research, if we have time, is we want to talk to landlords and find out what is the benefit of moving people in and out so quickly. But if they do win, they can get a lot of money out of the fees that accrue. There are some attorneys that will come in hard. So as soon as a tenant is, as soon as they've had their hearing, if a tenant doesn't show up, they could be, and Marty Baumstein has been the person that we've been consulting with on this, but what he's told us is that a landlord could essentially start charging fees upwards of 3 times the rent if they choose to. And so and that could be, that could accrue, and then down the line, essentially, it ruins people's credits. Yeah. So, but yeah, I honestly would defer to Utah Legal Services for some of the questions around the laws around that, but that's what we've heard through word of mouth. Yeah.
Are you looking at like the differences between someone who's low income just because of the job they hold and low income because maybe they're on like social security disability, and how that's maybe different?
Oh, like why? Yeah. We haven't talked about that. We're just looking at low income in general. We do have a question on our interview around source of income, so that might come out, but it's not part of our initial focus. Yeah, because there's a lot of different layers to it. So we've left the interviews fairly open with regards to like generally source of income, generally landlord, and rental size, things like that. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Have you met with the landlords yet?
Not yet. Phase 1, we actually didn't on purpose. The tenants, I think the tenants that we were talking to that were on our research team were like, there was so much historical trauma there for them that we said, don't worry, like let's just keep our research just focusing on tenants. But now though, we are focusing on tenants just because of the resources that we have. But if we reach saturation in our interviews before, using all the funds for the 20, before he did those 20, then we might actually reach out to landlords and start moving in that direction too. So, yeah, but like Rich said, we're hoping to try to make that website public so the community can be informed and you can kind of play around with it yourself and interpret and analyze it and make sense of it and use it to inform your practice, to advocate for tenants, things like that. So, yeah. All right, great. Well, if there's no more questions, oh yeah, yeah. Oh, the funding that we have. So yeah, I mean, we could, and actually somebody was like, well, you could interview the landlords for free. But our funding to fund community RAs and to pay for interview incentives, it only goes so far. So we just want to make sure that we reach saturation, get the most rich research or information that we can from the interviews with the tenants before focusing on another group. So yeah, so that's where we're focusing now. Cool. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, thanks for coming. If you have any questions, you can come chat with us, but hopefully we'll see you around. Oh, one last thing. There are postcards on the table. So from phase 1, we developed postcards that we distributed around the community at the Refugee March, at various events. So feel free to grab one. It sums up one of our findings. Each postcard has one finding on it from the phase 1 of research. So Community Voices for Housing Equality. Okay, right on. Thanks. Yeah.